The wind was a physical thing, a solid wall of grit that slammed against the New Mexico territory. 1883. The town of Cinder Knoll, little more than a rash of raw timber and adobe bleeding into the red desert, was being scoured from the map. The night air was alive, screaming. Sand, sharp as ground glass, found its way under the door of the territorial jail, piling in thin, curved dunes against the wall. It hissed across the stone floor. Inside the last cell, Elowen Price did not flinch. She sat on the cot, a bare plank frame with a pallet stuffed with dry, insect-ridden straw. The grit was in her hair, thick and dark. It was in her mouth. She tasted the iron of the desert, mingled with the iron of the bars. She was a tall woman, built on a scale that made the cells seem impossibly small. Her shoulders, broad and powerful from a life spent at the anvil, were slumped, not in defeat, but in a profound, bone-deep weariness. Her hands, cuffed in front of her, were her pride. They were Smith's hands, scarred by sparks, hardened by the hickory shaft of her mother's hammer, capable of shaping raw steel into a delicate hinge or a heavy plowshare. Now, those hands were cold, the circulation pinched by the heavy government-issue iron. The charge was absurd: murder, robbery. She had forged horseshoes for the man they claimed she killed. She had refused him. That was her crime. Refused his offer to buy her forge for pennies. Refused his clumsy, sweating advances. And for that, a fire had been set, a payroll box emptied, and a dead man found in the ashes. Her name, whispered by paid tongues, had become the only name. In the outer office, the pool of greasy yellow light from a kerosene lamp barely held back the shadows. Sheriff Bram Kettle sat at his desk, the small, dark shape of a whiskey bottle near his elbow. He was enjoying the storm. It was a fitting backdrop for the evening's work. Elowen heard the scratch of his pen. It was a vicious, dry sound, like a rat sharpening its claws on stone. He was signing the writ, the paper that declared her life forfeit to the territory at sunrise. The cell stank. It was a complex, suffocating odor, the sharp tang of cheap whiskey from the office, the ammonia of old urine in the corner bucket, the metallic sweat of fear from prisoners long gone, and the damp, earthy smell of rust. It was the smell of absolute hopelessness. Kettle pushed his chair back. The legs scraped, a sound that made Elowen's teeth ache. His heavy boots echoed on the floorboards as he approached her cell. He stood there for a long moment, a bulky silhouette, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. He jangled the heavy ring of keys at his belt. A petty, triumphant sound. "Won't be needing these for you much longer, Price," he rumbled, his voice thick. He peered closer, trying to see her face in the dark, hungry for her fear. Shame. A big woman like you probably snapped that rope clean. Elowen remained still. She did not give him the satisfaction of a word, or even a shudder. She simply stared back, her eyes accustomed to the dark, seeing the glint of his badge, the wetness of his lip as he smiled. "You should have just been cooperative," he added, a note of false sympathy. "Lucius Bram ain't a man to be trifled with. You could have been comfortable. Instead, you'll be breakfast for the crows." He waited. She said nothing. The ember of her will to live had burned low, buried under the ash of injustice. She would not let this man see it glow. Frustrated by her silence, Kettle grunted, "Sleep well." He turned, his spurs ringing softly, and walked back to his desk. He finished his whiskey, slammed the bottle down, and grabbed his slicker. The main jail door opened, letting in a furious, sand-choked blast of wind that made the lamp flame gutter wildly. Then the door slammed shut, and the bolt slid home. He was gone. She was alone, with the storm and the ticking clock on the office wall. Each tick was a hammer blow, forging the final, brittle moments of her life. She wasn't sure how much time passed. The storm was a constant, screaming noise that seemed to come from inside her own head. She had begun to drift, not sleeping but sinking into a cold place where the injustice no longer burned, a place of gray numbness. A new sound cut through the wind. It was distinct, Not the rattling of the ill-fitting window frame, not the scratching of sand. It was the deliberate click of a lockpick, or perhaps a master key, in the front office door. Elowen's head snapped up. Her heart, which had felt like a cold stone, gave a sudden, painful lurch. Kettle. Did he forget something? No, this was too quiet, too stealthy. The door creaked open, just enough for a man to slip through, and was eased shut without a sound. A figure stood in the office, a lean shadow against the faint, muddy light from the street lamp outside. He did not move toward the desk. He did not light a lamp. He stood perfectly still, listening. Elowen could hear his breathing over the wind. She could hear her own. He moved toward her, his boots making almost no sound on the dusty floor. He wasn't a lawman. He didn't have that heavy, assured stomp. He moved like a hunter, or prey. He stopped at her cell. She could see him more clearly now. He was tall, but not bulky. He wore a rancher's duster, stiff with alkali and dust. He held his hat in his hands, even in the gloom. She could see his eyes. They were not dark, but a pale, flat gray, like a sky moments before a cloudburst. They held no pity, but a desperate, calculating intelligence. Then, the impossible happened again. A metallic click, sharp and precise, at her cell door. Not Kettle's fumbling jangle. This was a single key, turned with purpose. The heavy, barred door swung open with a low groan of rusted hinges. The man stayed in the doorway, not crowding her space. "I'm here to get you out," he said. His voice was a rasp, barely audible, yet it cut through the storm. Elowen stared at him. This was a trick. This had to be one of Bram's men, a cruel joke before the hanging. Or worse, a different kind of prison. A rescue that meant indenture, a life of forced gratitude and service to a new master. She pressed herself harder against the back wall, the cold adobe seeping through her thin shirt. Her voice, when it came, was a dry whisper, torn by dust and disuse. "I'd rather die." She meant it. She would rather face the rope, clean and final, than be owned by any man ever again. The forge had been her freedom. They had taken it. She would not let them take the final choice from her. The man did not react with surprise. He seemed to have expected it. He looked at her cuffed hands, then back to her face. "This isn't a rescue to own you, Miss Price," he said, his voice flat. "All business. My name is Thaddeus Vale. I run a small ranch over at Juniper Bluff." He paused, letting the name settle. It meant nothing to her. "I don't care if you're guilty," he continued, his gray eyes fixed on hers. "I don't care about the payroll. I need what's in your head. I need an ally who understands metal, someone who knows machinery, levers, and stress points, someone who can look at a railroad trestle and know exactly how it was built, and exactly how it could fail." Elowen's breath caught. This was not the conversation of a savior, or a captor. This was the conversation of a strategist. "My brother, Rowan, is dead," Thad Vale said. And for the first time, a flicker of something raw grief, or perhaps just rage, crossed his face. "They said he was careless, slipped under a maintenance go-kart, but Rowan wasn't careless. He was a surveyor. He knew that line better than the man who built it." He took a half-step closer, lowering his voice even further. "The man who put you in here, Lucius Bram, is the same man who signed my brother's death certificate. I'm going to find out why, and I need your hands and your mind to do it." A sudden, brilliant flash of lightning lit the territory, turning the red dust outside the window into a momentary sheet of white fire. The light flashed through the cell, illuminating Thad Vale's face, gaunt, exhausted, but utterly resolved. And in that same flash, it illuminated the object he tossed through the open door. It landed on her cot with a soft, metallic click, a key, a small, filed-down bootleg key for her cuffs. Their eyes locked. His were a challenge. He was not offering her freedom. He was offering her a chance, a different cage, perhaps, but one with a purpose. "I don't need a servant," he said, as if reading her mind. "I need a partner, a confederate." Elowen stared at the key. It was real, cold, hard steel, hard. She whispered the only terms that mattered.
No one owns anyone.
Agreed, he said without hesitation. No one owns anyone, but we have to move. The night shift deputy makes his rounds in less than 300 heartbeats. He'll check this cell first. 300 heartbeats. 5 minutes. The ticking of the wall clock in the office suddenly seemed impossibly loud. A frantic hammering that matched the sudden, shocking pulse in her own throat. Tick-tock, tick. The sounds of the storm were drowned out by the sound of the approaching guard. Faint, distant, but regular. Heavy boots on the boardwalk. Coming this way, life, which had been a thing to be endured and discarded, suddenly became precious again. The ember, buried deep in the ash, flickered. Elowen Price reached for the key, her bound hands clumsy but desperate. She didn't look up at Vale. She looked at the open door, at the storm beyond. She bit her lip, tasting the grit and the salt of her own blood. She gave a single, sharp nod. The fire was back. The tiny, filed key was slippery in her cuffed hands. Elowen's fingers, built for the sure heavy grip of tongs and hammers, fumbled with the delicate mechanism. The deputy's boots were closer now, a steady, rhythmic crunch on the sand-strewn boardwalk. Each step was a tick of the clock. Tick, the key refused to turn. Tock, the boot fall landed harder. Her knuckles were white. The steel of the cuffs was cold, but her skin was colder. She was trapped between the immediate, physical threat of the approaching guard and the crushing weight of the past that had pinned her here. The sound of the key scraping inside the lock, a dry, metallic protest, transported her. It was not the jailhouse she heard, but the clear, high ring of her mother's hammer striking the anvil. Ember Ferry. It was a town born of coal, living under a permanent haze of charcoal smoke. Their forge, Price Daughter, was at the town's edge, its wide doors always open, spilling the orange glow of the hearth onto the packed dirt street. Her mother, Maeve Price, was a woman carved from the same hickory as her hammer shaft. She was not tall, but she was dense with muscle, her forearms corded, her face mapped by soot and sweat. Elowen, even at 15, already towered over her, inheriting a frame from a father long gone, but the strength came from Maeve. "You don't fight the steel, Elowen," Maeve would say, her voice calm over the hiss of the slack tub. They worked in tandem, a rhythm of 2 hammers, one heavy, one light, shaping a wagon wheel's iron hoop. "You listen to it. It tells you when it's ready to move." Maeve pulled the glowing metal from the coals, her face serene in the blistering heat. "Steel bends in fire. Girl, people bend in pain. The trick isn't to avoid the heat. It's to know what shape you want to be on the other side." Then came the father Elowen barely remembered, a ghost who smelled of cheap rye, who drifted back into their lives just long enough to sign a deed. He sold the forge from under them for whiskey money, leaving them with nothing but the tools and a lease agreement to the new owner, a dry goods merchant who knew nothing of metal. Elowen, 16 and already bearing the broad back and powerful shoulders of her trade, took her mother's hammer, a heavy cross-peen with a distinct, seahorse-shaped head, and became the town's only smith. She paid the ruinous rent. She fed her ailing mother. She shod their horses, mended their plows, and built the iron gates for the new bank. And she endured the whispers. The men who came for work stared, their eyes lingering on her arms, her shoulders. The women of the town spoke behind their hands. "Unnatural," they'd say. "Built like an ox. No man will ever—" She learned to ignore them. The hammer was honest. The steel was honest. They did not judge the hand that shaped them. Then Lucius Bram arrived with the railroad. Bram was a man who moved without making a sound, soft in body and voice, but his eyes were like 2 chips of dry ice. He was the railroad foreman, the man who brought the future, and he wanted her forge. The land was vital for a new spur line, a depot. He came to her, his hat in his soft hands, his voice a buttery purr. "Miss Price, a woman of your scale must find this work so taxing." "It's my work," she'd answered, not stopping the bellows. "The railroad is prepared to offer you a fair price. $50. For your lease, your tools, a chance to start fresh. Find a new life, a more suitable one. $50. It was an insult. The anvil alone was worth more. This was my mother's forge, she said, her voice flat. It's not for sale. Bram's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. Everything is for sale. Miss Price, it is just a matter of finding the correct currency. He tried for weeks. He offered 70. He offered 100. He sent men to negotiate who leaned on her tool rack and hinted at how easily a forge could catch fire. She faced them down, her hammer never leaving her hand. She was not steel, to be bent by his heat. She was iron. She would not bend. She would only break. His animosity became a palpable thing, a shadow that stretched over her shop. The past and present collided. The sound of Bram's quiet, threatening voice was lost in the immediate, sharp sound of the deputy's boot hitting the wooden step right outside the jail office. The key clicked. One cuff sprang open. Elowen ripped her hand free, the skin raw, and frantically set to work on the other. Thad Vale stood like a statue, watching the office door. His body coiled. He had not moved. He simply held his ground. A silent sentinel. The second click. The other cuff fell away, hitting the stone floor with a heavy, dead clang. The sound was shockingly loud. It was as loud as the night the warehouse burned. That night, she had been asleep, exhausted from a 20-hour day mending a boiler for the sawmill. She awoke to shouting, to the smell of kerosene and pine. The railroad's payroll warehouse, 2 streets over, was an inferno. By dawn, she was in chains. Bram himself stood by, a look of profound sorrow on his face. As a witness claimed he saw Elowen running from the fire, a heavy satchel in her hand. Another claimed she'd been bragging about getting what she was owed. They found a broken payroll box, empty, near the ashes. They found forged papers, proving she had been stealing from the railroad for months. It was a perfect, airtight frame. She, the unnatural woman, the disgruntled Smith who had been publicly hostile to the railroad. It was simple. It was clean. It was a lie forged as perfectly as any piece of steel she had ever made. Her mother, Maeve, had died 2 weeks before, her lungs finally giving out to the coal dust. The forge was Elowen's only inheritance, the hammer, her only legacy. Bram had taken both. She escaped before the circuit judge arrived. She just walked away. She slipped her guards in Ember Ferry, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's seahorse hammer, tucked into her belt. She ran to Cinder Knoll, a town far enough away, she thought, to start over. She sought work, not as a smith, just as a hand, anything, but her reputation, or perhaps just her description, had traveled faster. Sheriff Bram Kettle had been waiting for her. He hadn't just arrested her, he'd seemed to know she was coming. He'd grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising, his teeth yellow in a triumphant grin. Lucius Bram sends his regards. Girly, said you were uncooperative. And now she was here, her wrists raw, her mother's honor in ashes, her own life measured in minutes. She was not just fighting to survive. She was fighting to restore the name of Maeve Price. She scrambled to her feet, rubbing her wrists, the blood roaring back into her hands with 1,000 needle pricks of pain. Thad Vale finally looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the motive that went beyond simple self-preservation. "The man who put you in here," he said, his voice low and urgent. The deputy's footsteps now pacing in the outer office. "Is the one I'm after, Bram. He framed me," Elowen whispered, her voice rough. "Burned the payroll, killed a man to do it, all to take my land." "He did more than that," Thad said, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "My brother, Rowan, was a surveyor for the railroad. He wasn't just a number cruncher. He was honest, too honest." Elowen remembered the talk, the young surveyor. Rowan Vale, a decent man, liked by the ranchers, crushed under a go-kart. A terrible accident. "Rowan found something," Thad continued, his voice barely a breath. He found out Bram wasn't just building a railroad. He was building an empire, skimming money, using shoddy materials, extorting ranchers for right-of-way. Rowan was documenting it. He kept a ledger, a private one. He called it his milepost ledger. Thad's gray eyes seemed to look through her, into a past he couldn't escape. The day Rowan slipped, that ledger disappeared. So did Bram's official accounting book, swept up in the confusion. They said, "But I know Bram has it. He's too arrogant to destroy it. It's his proof, his power." Suddenly, the two paths of their revenge, born of fire and forged in grief, snapped together. Her forge, his brother, the dirty law, the railroad. It was all one tangled, rusted chain. Bram was the anchor. Kettle was just a link. Elowen understood. "You think my framing was a convenience?" Thad finished. "Bram needed your land. But he also needed to silence anyone who might talk. He used your trouble to send a message, and to get Kettle promoted to sheriff here, where the main line is coming through. Kettle is his man. He controls this whole section of the territory." Their shared purpose hung in the rank air between them. It was simple, and it was impossible. "We need to find that book," Elowen said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "That black ledger," Thad confirmed. "It's the only thing that proves any of it. The only thing that can clear your name, and the only thing that can hang Bram for what he did to Rowan." He looked toward the cell window, toward the distant, unseen line of mountains. Rowan was working near Shale Teeth Canyon when he died. It's rough country. Perfect place to hide something you don't want found. Shale Teeth Canyon. The name tasted like dust. A heavy fist hammered on the outer office door. "Sheriff, you in there? Storm's getting worse?" It was the deputy. He was outside. Thad Vale grabbed her arm. His grip was not like Kettle's. It was not an act of ownership. It was an anchor. 300 heartbeats, he whispered. "Are gone." The fist hammered on the office door again. Harder this time. "Sheriff, open this door. I know you're in there. I saw the lamp. I'm coming in." A key scraped in the main lock. A fumbling, impatient sound. Thad Vale didn't wait. He was pure, fluid motion. He crossed the office in 2 silent strides, his duster swirling. He didn't move toward the deputy. He moved to the small, filthy window at the back of the office, a square of glass that looked out onto the jail's rear yard and the teeth of the storm. "He's coming through the front." Thad breathed, his voice a flat line. "Stay in the cell. Stay in the shadow." He unlatched the window. With a noise like tearing canvas, he slid the wooden frame upward. The storm immediately invaded. A solid, screaming wave of red sand that choked the air and sent papers flying from Kettle's desk. Thad swung one long leg over the sill, paused, and then dropped, vanishing into the howling darkness. Elowen pressed herself into the darkest corner of her open cell, her heart a cold, heavy thing in her chest. This was insane. This was a rat trap. The office door crashed open. "Sheriff Kettle! Damn it!" The deputy's voice was young, reedy with panic. He staggered in, a lantern held high, its light cutting a wild, greasy yellow arc through the chaos of dust and paper. "Where in the hell?" He saw the open cell. His breath hitched. He saw the empty cot, the discarded cuffs on the floor. "Prisoner, escape!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Prisoner!" A sound from the backyard cut him off. It was not the storm. It was a tremendous, resonant clang, the sound of heavy iron striking stone, followed immediately by the splintering crash of a large pile of wood. It was a sound of absolute destruction. "What in the—" The deputy's panic was instantly diverted. He gripped his pistol, his training forgotten, and ran straight through the office toward the back door, the one Thad had just exited beside. "Who's back there? Show yourself." He kicked the back door open and lunged into the yard, raising his lantern high to find the source of the noise. Thad had done his work. The jail's heavy iron water trough, used for the horses, was overturned, its contents spilling into the dust. The entire winter woodpile had been toppled, a perfect, loud, and dramatic diversion. As the deputy stood on the top step, peering into the swirling red darkness, Elowen moved. She didn't run, she calculated. She saw the office water barrel by the door, the one kept for drinking, a wooden dipper bucket hanging from its side. She wasn't built for stealth. She was built for power. She grabbed the heavy oak dipper, plunged it into the barrel, and heaved. She didn't throw it at the deputy. She threw the entire bucket of water at the wooden threshold and the steps he was standing on. The water hit the dry, dusty planks. In an instant, it was a sheet of treacherous, slick mud. The deputy heard the splash. He spun, confused, his boot hitting the new, invisible patch of slime. He yelped, his arms pinwheeling for balance. The wind, as if on cue, delivered the final blow. A furious gust blasted through the open back door, carrying a thick sheet of sand. The dry grit hit the deputy's wet face and open, shouting mouth. It became an instant, blinding paste. He screamed, a muffled, terrified sound, dropping the lantern and his pistol to claw at his eyes. I can't see my eyes. The lantern hit the steps, its glass shattered, and the flame died. The world plunged into absolute darkness, filled only with the man's screams and the roar of the wind. Now, Thad's voice came from the blackness, right by her elbow. He was back inside. Elowen didn't need to be told. She didn't run for the door. She ran to the evidence locker behind Kettle's desk. It was cheap pine, the lock a joke. She didn't bother with it. She put her hand on the handle and tore the door from its hinges. Her hand closed around the hickory shaft of her mother's seahorse hammer. The moment her fingers gripped the worn wood, her world settled. The panic vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The weight was perfect, familiar. It was an extension of her arm. She saw the other item they'd taken, a long, coiled strap of dark, cured leather. She looped it over her shoulder, her only possessions, her inheritance. Thad was already moving, pulling her toward a third door, one she hadn't noticed, connecting the office to the town livery. He had a carbine looped over his own shoulder. Elowen noted it with a smith's eye, a Spencer repeater, a serious weapon. But as they passed the open office door, a flicker of lightning illuminated the rifle's side. The loading gate was open. The magazine was empty. It was a bluff, a shell. He was armed to look the part. Not to kill. This way, the horses are saddled, he hissed. They burst into the livery. The air was warm, thick with the smell of hay and manure. A sudden, shocking pocket of peace. The animals were not peaceful. They whinnied, stamping in their stalls, terrified by the storm and the deputy's screams from the next room. Thad moved to a tall, raw-boned bay, unlatching the stall. But Elowen was drawn to the corner, a magnificent black mare, trembling so hard the stall boards rattled. Kettle's new horse, confiscated. Night lantern. Elowen whispered. She knew the mare. She had shot her 2 weeks ago, admiring the fine, strong bones, the intelligent eyes. The horse snorted, its eyes white, ready to bolt and bring the whole town down on them. Leave her, Thad ordered, his voice tight. She's too spooked. We'll take the bay. No. Elowen walked toward the stall. She didn't offer a hand to be bitten. She just stood, exuding a solid, unshakable calm. She let her breath out in a long, slow sigh, a sound she'd used to use to bank the forge fire for the night. Easy, girl, easy, lantern. It's just wind, just wind. She put her hand, the broad, calloused smith's hand, flat on the mare's quivering neck. The trembling didn't stop, but it lessened. The mare leaned into the steady, solid pressure, as if anchoring herself. Elowen didn't waste time looking for a saddle. She grabbed the bridle from the hook, slipped the cold bit into the mare's mouth with a practiced, gentle efficiency, and threw the stall door open. She would ride bareback. Thad was already on the bay. He threw open the wide livery doors, and they plunged into the alley, a narrow canyon between the jail and the Red Dog Saloon. There, stop, right there. The deputy. He stumbled out of the jail's back door, his face a grotesque mask of mud, his pistol recovered. He was blind, but he was shooting. Thad vaulted onto his horse. Elowen, grabbing a handful of night lantern's thick mane, swung her leg over the mare's broad back with an agility that defied her size. She dug her heels into the horse's flanks. The alley was a blur of flying debris, crates, barrels, a loose wagon wheel spinning in the wind. Night Lantern moved like a shadow, leaping a pile of trash, her hooves finding purchase in the slick mud. Behind them, the crack of the deputy's pistol was thin and sharp. A spark, bright orange, exploded from the tin sign of the Red Dog Saloon, just inches from Elowen's head. The sign spun wildly, screaming on its rusted hinge. They burst from the alley onto the town's secondary street, heading for the dark, open desert. A short, rickety wooden bridge crossed the dry arroyo that cut Cinder Knoll in two. Their horses' hooves sounded a frantic, hollow thump, 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 thump on the loose planks. The entire bridge swayed under their combined, galloping weight. They were phantoms, two paper cutouts against the swirling red-black night, swallowed instantly by the storm. They didn't slow. Thad led her past the last silent, dark houses, past the tannery with its sharp, chemical smell, and then cut hard left, down into the arroyo bed itself. The sand was deep, slowing the horses to a lunging run, but it muffled their tracks. Above them, the massive, skeletal structure of the railroad aqueduct loomed, a dark grid against the darker sky. "Under here," Thad yelled. Pulling his bay to a skidding halt, they dismounted, pushing the horses into the deep shadow of a massive stone support pillar. The wind howled through the trestles high above, but down here, in the lee of the stone, it was almost silent. There was only the sound of the horses' heaving flanks, the creak of Thad's saddle leather, and their own ragged, desperate breathing. Elowen leaned against the cold stone, her mother's hammer heavy in her hand. Her knuckles were white. Thad stood opposite her, his back pressed to the same pillar, his empty carbine held loosely. He was watching the way they came. Elowen could feel the vibration of his body through the stone, or perhaps it was her own. She could hear the frantic pulse in her ears. 1, 2, 1, 2. It was joined by another, deeper beat. His. The pounding of their hearts filled the small, quiet space, a frantic rhythm against the distant, screaming wind. Far off, they heard a train whistle, a lonely, mournful sound. The iron snake, the cause of it all. Thad finally looked at her. His gray eyes were impossible to read in the dark, but his voice was steady. "Allies," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of their pact. "No chains," she replied, her voice firm. She gripped the hammer. The sound of pursuit had faded, swallowed by the storm. The deputy wouldn't risk the arroyo. They were safe. For now. Thad reached inside his duster. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was stiff, the edges blackened and burnt. He handed it to her. Elowen unfolded it. Even in the near-total darkness, her fingers, trained to read the texture of hot metal, could feel the raised lines of ink. It was a schematic, a map. "My brother's," Thad said. "It was in his coat pocket when they found him. The only thing that survived the accident." She traced the lines. A rail yard, a warehouse, a main office, a water tower. It's a layout of Bram's main supply depot, Black Silt. "It's where he keeps his real records, the ones he doesn't show the railroad. I think the ledger is there. Kettle will know I'm gone by now," she said, her voice flat. "The deputy will sober him up. He'll send word to Bram. They'll move the book." "Exactly," Thad said. He pointed up, toward the unseen railroad tracks on the aqueduct above them. "There's an inspection train. Comes through from Santa Fe every week. It's due here, Monday morning. Bram will be on it. He'll either take the ledger with him back east or destroy it. Whatever we're going to do, we have to get that book before that train arrives." Elowen looked from the burnt map to Thad's shadowed face. Monday morning. She didn't even know what day it was. "That gives us," Thad said, answering her unasked question as he swung back onto his horse, "about 48 hours." They rode for 2 hours, guided by the stars that began to pierce the clearing storm. The wind had died, leaving the air cold and thin. scoured clean. The desert was a vast, silver-gray landscape of bone. Thad kept the pace hard, pushing the horses through the sand-choked arroyos and up onto the high, flat mesa. Elowen rode Night Lantern bareback, her body aching, her wrists rubbed raw. But she did not complain. The mare, seemingly recognizing a fellow fugitive, moved with a steady, powerful gait, responding to the pressure of Elowen's knees and the slightest touch on her mane. Elowen's hammer was tucked into the leather strap at her waist, its weight a familiar comfort against her hip. She felt its balance with every lope of the horse. Thad rode slightly ahead, his body a lean silhouette against the emerging starlight. He looked back only twice, not to check on her, Elowen realized, but to check for pursuit. He was treating her as a capable hand, an equal in this desperate flight. The simple, unspoken assumption of her competence was a balm, more soothing than any salve could have been for her wrists. As the first, pale, watery light of dawn bled into the eastern sky, they crested a long ridge. Below them lay Juniper Bluff. It was not a ranch, it was the memory of one. The main house was a low-slung wooden structure, its shingles long gone, replaced by mismatched patches of rust-red tin. The cattle pens were a jagged line of broken fences, half buried in drifted sand. The barn, its roof sagging in the middle, looked as if one strong wind would finish it. A handful of thin, dusty calves stood listlessly by a dry water trough, their breathing punctuated by a dry, rattling cough. This was not a place of power. It was a place on the brink of vanishing. Thad saw her taking it in, his face grim in the gray light. "It was Rowan's," he said, his voice flat. "He managed the books. I managed the cattle. Since he's been gone, he didn't need to finish." The ranch was dying of neglect and grief. As they dismounted, the front door of the house creaked open. A woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. She was not old, but she was not young. Her hair was thick silver black, pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was brown and deeply lined, and her eyes were the blackest Elowen had ever seen, sharp and missing nothing. She held herself with a ramrod-straight posture that defied the sagging porch she stood on. Thad's demeanor changed. The hard-edged fugitive softened. "Just a fraction. Tia," he said, walking toward her, pulling off his hat. "This is Elowen Price. She needs sanctuary. She's an ally." Senora Isidora Quintero's eyes moved from Thad's face to Elowen. The gaze was not welcoming. It was an assessment, as thorough and invasive as a physical search. She took in Elowen's height, the broad shoulders, the soot-stained clothes ripped from the escape, the raw wrists, and the heavy hammer at her belt. Isidora looked back at her nephew. Her voice was low, and it did not tremble. "Trajiste fuego a esta casa, mijo," she said. She switched to flawless, unaccented English, her eyes fixed on Elowen. "You brought fire into this house, Thaddeus. Fire saves, and it burns. You be sure you know which one this is." "She's the one, Tia," Thad said, his voice quiet but firm. "She's the only one who can help." Isidora's gaze lingered on Elowen for a beat longer. Then she nodded. "Once. The calves are coughing, the pump is broken, the fire is cold." It was a list of failures. She turned and went back inside. Elowen and Thad tended the horses, giving them the last of the decent water from a barrel by the door. Night Lantern nuzzled Elowen's shoulder, a quiet gesture of trust. "The pump," Elowen said. Walking over to the trough, she worked the long iron handle. It moved uselessly, with no resistance. "What's wrong with it?" "The linkage pin," Thad said, rubbing the back of his neck, his exhaustion evident. "It sheared clean off 2 days ago. The metal was brittle. I haven't had time to ride to Cinder Knoll for a new one. And now you can't," Elowen finished. She examined the mechanism, her fingers tracing the empty hole where the pin should be. "You have a forge." He looked surprised. "A small one, for shoes, but the anvil has a crack." "It doesn't matter," Elowen said. "Show me." For the next hour, Elowen Price was no longer a fugitive. She was a smith. Thad's forge was in a small, three-sided shed. It was cold, the coal bin nearly empty. She found a heavy, discarded wagon axle head half buried near the barn and, with Thad's help, rolled it into the shed, setting it upright on a stump. It was a poor substitute for a true anvil, but it was solid iron. It would do. She found a scrap of iron from a broken plowshare. She laid the fire in the forge, her motions economical and precise. Thad stood by, watching. He seemed to understand her gestures before she made them, handing her the bellows, finding a hammer, bringing a bucket of water. He watched her heat the iron. He watched her lay the glowing red metal on the axle head and bring her mother's seahorse hammer down. Clang. The sound was clean and true, a clear, ringing note of purpose that cut through the dusty despair of the ranch. It was a sound of creation. Clang, clang, clang. Thad watched her work, and his expression shifted. He had seen her as a tool, a key to unlock his revenge. But now, he watched the sweat trace a line through the soot on her cheek. He watched the muscles in her shoulders and back move with practiced, fluid power under her torn shirt. It was not the stare she was used to, the furtive, judging, or hungry looks of men in Ember Ferry. This was the gaze of a man watching a master craftsman, a gaze of profound, almost startled, respect. He was not seeing a woman who was too much. He was seeing a woman who was, finally, exactly enough. In less than an hour, she had forged a new linkage pin, hardening it in the water, her face impassive in the plume of steam. She took it to the pump. It slid into place with perfect, snug precision. She stood back. "Try it," she said. Thad took the handle. He pumped it once, twice. There was a gurgle, a sigh, and then a beautiful, clear stream of water gushed from the spout, splashing into the dry trough. It was a silver ribbon in the morning sun. A sound, a short, sharp exhalation, came from the porch. Senora Isidora stood there, watching. She met Elowen's eyes, and for the first time, the severe line of her mouth softened. She gave a single, small nod. It was a bigger welcome than a feast. The calves, their thirst overcoming their sickness, stumbled toward the trough. The ranch had taken a breath. That evening, the three of them sat at the small, scrubbed pine table in Isidora's kitchen. The room was immaculate, a stark contrast to the decay outside. The meal was simple beans, fresh cornbread, and coffee so weak it was little more than browned water. But it was hot, and it was safe. The silence was thick at first, the tension of their shared predicament filling the room. Then, Isidora spoke, her voice dry. "That old rooster, El Capitan, he's gone now, but he was a smart bird. Knew the train schedule better than the station master." Thad smiled into his cup. "Tia, don't." "It's true," Isidora insisted, looking at Elowen. "That 8:15 train from Santa Fe, the one with the mail every morning, at 8:13. That bird would crow. Not before, not after. 2 minutes before the whistle? Every time. I think he was in love with the boiler." The image was so absurd, so purely, stupidly funny, a rooster in love with a steam engine, that something rusty and unfamiliar broke loose in Elowen's chest. A short, rough sound came from her throat. It was a laugh. It felt strange, like a muscle she hadn't used in years. Thad looked at her, and his own smile widened. He saw the tension break in her face, saw the person beneath the fugitive. It was the first real laugh he had heard in this house since Rowan died. Later, as Isidora cleared the plates, she paused by Elowen. She noted the long, jagged tear in Elowen's sleeve, where the deputy's bullet had grazed the saloon sign. Wordlessly, she gestured for Elowen's shirt. Elowen, hesitant, removed the heavy leather strap and her hammer, and slipped the torn garment off, leaving her in her thin chemise. She was not embarrassed. She was simply cold. Isidora took the shirt, went to a small basket by the fire, and took out a needle and thread. She sat, the fabric in her lap, and began to sew. The tiny, even stitches were a quiet act of trust, mending more than just the cloth. Thad waited until his aunt was absorbed in her work. He motioned Elowen to the fireplace, away from the table, from a small, carved box on the mantel. He took out a folded, worn piece of paper. "This," he said, his voice low, "is the last letter I got from Rowan. He sent it to me in Santa Fe. Not here. He didn't want Tia to worry." Elowin took it. The handwriting was neat, precise. The words of an engineer. It spoke of his work, his measurements, his growing unease with Bram's accounting. And then, the phrase, "I am keeping my own record. Bram thinks I am a fool, but I have it all in my milepost ledger. He cannot hide the truth." At the bottom of the page, there was a dark, reddish-brown smudge, almost like a fingerprint, next to Rowan's signature. Elowin turned the paper over in her hands, her brow furrowing. She rubbed the smudge with her thumb. It was gritty. She brought it to her nose, a faint, sharp, metallic tang. "This stain," she said, her voice quiet. "It's not blood." "No," Thad said. "I thought it was just ink." "It is," Elowin said, her eyes meeting his. "But it's a specific kind. It's iron gallet ink, rust ink, made with gallic acid and iron filings from a forge or a rail yard." They stared at each other, the connection forming. The ink itself was a clue. It tied Rowan's proof to the very material that Bram and Elowin both wrestled with. Isadora finished her mending. She handed the shirt back to Elowin. It was clean, the tear sealed with a line of perfect, strong stitches. "There is a cot in the pantry," she said. "It is small, but it is warm." Elowin put the mended shirt on. It felt different, stronger. She stepped outside onto the porch, needing a moment of the cold night air. The storm was gone. The sky was a vast, terrifying blanket of black, so clear it felt as if she could fall right into it. The Milky Way was a brilliant, shimmering spill, a chaotic dusting of light. She had always thought of it as a river, but tonight it looked different. It looked like a handful of metallic dust, the bright, hot filings from her own anvil, cast across the heavens. It was a promise, not of peace, but of creation. A bond was forming, forged in a shared need, and tempered by a simple, quiet act of mending a broken pump. The next day was a shroud of tense silence. They had 48 hours. They had a target, but the Black Silt Depot was a fortress of new timber and railroad steel, squatting on the edge of town, protected by Bram's hired guards. They were two people against a corporation, and they were trapped on a dying ranch. Just after noon, a rider approached from the east, not from town. He moved at a steady, ground-eating lope, a thin, dark figure on a wiry Mustang. Isadora, who had been watching the horizon, merely nodded and went inside to put another cup on the table. Thad stepped onto the porch. "Rook," he said. The rider dismounted, his movements economical. Silent. He was Ute, his frame slender, his face a sharp, hawk-like mask of concentration. He nodded to Thad, his eyes flicking to Elowin. He assessed her as Isadora had, but his gaze was different. He saw the hammer at her belt, and his eyes lingered on it with something like professional respect. He was Rook Bene Pa, a man who had been Rowan Vale's closest friend and guide. "They are looking for you," Rook said to Elowin. His voice was soft, like wind over dry rock. "They search the saloons. They think you are a drunkard. They are fools. They're Bram's fools," Thad said. "What did you find?" Rook reached into the leather pouch at his hip. He produced a piece of dark, oilcloth-bound cardboard. It was thick, stiff, and the edge was violently torn. "I have been watching the depot," Rook said. "Since Rowan fell last night after the storm. The guards were careless. This was snagged on the new wire fence. He must have dropped it." He handed it to Thad. On the black, slightly greasy cover was a perfect, clear handprint, pressed into a smear of axle grease. Thad's breath hitched. "It's the cover, from the milepost ledger." Elowin looked closer. "Bram's hand," she said. It was a statement. The print was from a soft, fleshy hand, not a worker's. "He was there," Rook confirmed. "He is careless, he is arrogant, and he is nervous. He returns to the office often. He checks his sign." Thad unfolded the burnt schematic. "The depot is locked down. Guards on the gates. Guards on the roof." Elowen took the schematic from him. She wasn't looking at the gates. She was looking at the foundation lines, the small, precise markings that Rowan had drawn. "What about this?" she said, pointing to a dotted line that ran from the riverbank. "Under the main warehouse. It's marked Storm Culvert." "It's there," Thad said, nodding. "But it's barred. 3/4-inch iron, set in stone, and the opening on the inside is covered by a ventilation grate, bolted from the inside." "Bolted," Elowen said, the word tasting of opportunity. "Not riveted. What kind of bolts?" "Standard hexagonal," Thad said, "but they're set deep in a well to keep them from rusting. You can't get a standard wrench in there. Then we don't use a standard wrench." Elowen said. She went to the forge. She took a long, thin piece of high-carbon steel from an old, broken wagon spring. For an hour, she worked. The clear, ringing clang of her hammer on the makeshift anvil was the only sound at Juniper Bluff. She heated, bent, and quenched. She didn't forge a key. She forged a tool. It was a long, thin rod of steel, with a perfectly angled, narrow-walled socket wrench forged at the end. It was a piece of custom, beautiful, and highly illegal engineering. That night, the moon was a sliver, the air bitingly cold. Black Silt Depot was a massive, angular shadow. They moved low and fast, following the riverbank to the mouth of the culvert. It was a black, dripping hole, smelling of cold mud and iron runoff. The bar was exactly as Thad had described. Elowen slid her custom tool into the recessed well. The bolt was rusted, frozen. She put her shoulder against the end of the rod, not just pushing, but using a smith's knowledge, tapping the bar to send a shock wave through the metal and break the rust. She leaned. The bolt shrieked, a high, agonizing, metallic sound. They both froze, but the sound was swallowed by the gurgle of the river. One by one. 4 bolts. She slid the heavy iron bars aside. They were in. The tunnel was claustrophobic. They crawled on hands and knees, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and something old, like decay. Their breath plumed in front of them, white and ghostly in the pitch black. Elowen could feel the slick, cold moss on the stones beneath her palms. Suddenly, a low rumble started, a vibration in her bones. It grew to a deafening physical roar that shook the very ground. A heavy freight train was passing directly overhead. The noise was absolute, the pressure of 1,000 tons of steel just feet above them. Elowen clamped her hands over her ears, her heart seizing. She felt a steadying pressure on her back. Thad's hand, it rested there, solid, until the last car passed and the crushing sound faded, leaving only the drip, drip, drip of water. The tunnel ended at a heavy iron grate, the ventilation shaft Thad had mentioned. Elowen used her tool again. These bolts were newer, easier. They turned with a well-oiled whisper. The grate swung open. They were in a sub-basement. It was vast, dark, and smelled of machine oil, burlap, and old paper. Thad took the lead, the burnt schematic in his hand, moving with a hunter's certainty. Up a narrow set of wooden stairs, down a corridor. They stopped at a heavy steel door, far more imposing than the others. The archives. Thad whispered. He pointed to the 3 distinct, brass-plated locks. Triple locked. He knelt, pulling a small leather case from his boot. He inserted a thin tension pick and went to work on the first lock. Elowen stood guard, her hammer in her hand, her ears straining. Click. The first lock sprang. He moved to the second, a more complex mechanism. He probed, retreated, probed again. Click. He moved to the third, at the bottom. He worked for a full minute, his breath hissing in frustration. "It's different," he whispered. "It's newer." Elowen knelt beside him. "Let me see." She wasn't looking at the lock. She was looking at the door frame, the floor, the threshold. "Wait." "What?" "The air," she whispered. She could feel a tiny, almost imperceptible draft at the bottom of the door. "It's trapped, a spring gun, or an alarm." Thad strained. I don't see anything. You're not supposed to. Elowen reached into the small leather pouch at her belt. She took a tiny pinch of something between her thumb and forefinger. What is that? Iron filings. From the forge. She held her hand near the lock and blew. A soft, controlled puff of air. The microscopic, glittering dust did not fall to the ground. It swirled, and then it clung to the air, perfectly outlining a wire so thin it was almost invisible, running from the lock mechanism to a tiny pressure plate under the threshold. The magnetic field of the wire, insignificant to the eye, was a beacon to the iron. A smith's trick, she breathed. We use it to find hairline fractures in cooling steel. She slid her new tool under the door, below the wire, and carefully, precisely, wedged the pressure plate, disabling the trigger. Now, Thad, his face pale with sweat and admiration, returned to the lock. This time, he found the tumbler. Click! The heavy steel door swung open on silent hinges. The room was a library of lies, shelves from floor to ceiling, stacked with ledgers. It has to be here, Thad said, his voice frantic, pulling down book after book. Payroll, shipping, invoices. Elowen took the torn oilcloth cover from her pocket. She didn't read the labels. She looked at the bindings. She ran her hand along the spines. This one. She pulled a thick, black ledger from the shelf. The spine was intact, but the front cover was half gone. A jagged tear. She held Rook's piece against it, a perfect match. They opened it. Rowan's neat, precise hand. It was all there. The skimmed profits, the addresses of extorted ranchers, the shoddy materials. And then they reached the middle. The book was empty. The last half of the pages had been sliced out with a razor-sharp knife. No, Thad whispered, his face ashen. Elowen pointed. Tucked into the binding was a small, folded note. It was Bram's handwriting, arrogant and fluid. Remainder held in RX-13 personal safe for review. RX-13, Thad breathed. The inspection train. Monday morning. He split the evidence. A sudden shout echoed from the sub-basement. Hey, the vent cover on the culvert. The bolts are sheared clean off. Someone's in here. A bell began to clang. A loud, frantic, jarring sound that filled the entire building. Alarm! Run! Thad said. They bolted. Down the stairs, into the sub-basement hall. A guard appeared at the far end, raising a lantern and a rifle. Halt! Stop right there! A shot exploded, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Wood splintered from the wall beside Elowen's head. Thad grabbed her, shoving her into the main warehouse. Shelves, 30 feet high, towered over them like canyon walls, filled with couplers, axles, and heavy chains. They're at both ends, Elowen panted. 2 more guards ran in from the far side, blocking the way back to the rail yard. They were boxed in. This way, Thad yelled, pulling her down a narrow aisle. He pointed at a massive, overloaded shelf of wooden crates. Help me. He pushed. It didn't budge. Elowen didn't just push. She looked at the base, saw the slight bow in the wood, found the center of gravity. On 3, she grunted. Not at the middle. At the brace. Now. She put her entire body, all her forge-driven power, into a single, focused heave. Thad, following her lead, pushed at the same spot. The wood screamed. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a sound like a tree trunk splitting, the entire shelving unit groaned, tilted, and toppled over. It hit the concrete floor with a crash that shook the building like an earthquake, a 20-foot-high wall of debris, completely blocking the guard's path. They scrambled, Thad leading, climbing the mountain of splintered pine and scattered machine parts. Thad, lighter, moved like a cat. Elowen, holding the half-ledger, was right behind him, her heavy boots finding purchase. As she neared the top, the wreckage shifted. She slid, her ankle twisting. A sharp bolt of pain shot up her leg, but she ignored it, grabbing a broken beam and hauling herself over the top. The guards were shouting. Invisible behind the wall of debris, they were in the open rail yard. The alarm bell was deafening. Lanterns were fanning out, a net of light closing around them. The cars! Thad yelled. pointing to a long line of stationary freight cars. He slid open the heavy door of a boxcar. It was full to the ceiling with bales of hay. In deep. They climbed in, pulling the door shut to a tiny crack, and burrowed, digging themselves like animals into the dry, fragrant and intensely itchy mountain of hay. They lay side by side in the absolute dark, buried. The hay was sharp, poking through their clothes, filling their hair. Elowen could feel a single, sharp piece of straw against her cheek, and it was taking all her willpower not to scream. They heard the guards run past. "Check the cars! Check every car!" A lantern beam cut through the crack in the door, a brilliant, terrifying white stripe that passed right over their hiding place. The beam moved on. Elowen was vibrating, her body screaming from the adrenaline and the maddening, relentless itch of the hay. In the dark, she felt Thad's hand brush hers. It wasn't an accident. His fingers, calloused and warm, closed around her hand. It was not a pull. It was not a claim. It was not the grip of a man wanting something. It was just a hold, a steady, solid pressure. It was an anchor in the dark, a silent communication, an "I am here. Be still. We are safe." Her breath, which she had been holding in a tight, painful knot, released in a slow, silent sigh. The maddening itch faded, the terror receded. There was only the solid warmth of his hand and the sound of his breathing, steady and quiet, beside her. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity that cut through the hay-scented darkness, that in her entire life, no man had ever held her hand this way, never for simple reassurance, never as an equal. They waited an hour. The shouting faded, moving toward the front of the depot. "They've given up," Thad whispered. "They think we went to town," she whispered back. They slipped out, crawling under the train, and slid down the embankment into the cold, thick mud of the river marsh. They were covered, head to foot, in slime, sweat, and hay. They were exhausted. They were hunted. They stopped 100 yards away, hidden in the reeds, and looked back. The depot was a blaze of light, men still running uselessly. Thad looked at her. Her face was a smear of mud and soot. A long piece of hay was sticking straight up from her hair. He tried to stifle it, but a short, low chuckle escaped him. Elowen saw where he was looking. She reached up, felt the hay, and looked at him, at the matching grime on his own face. A rough, barking sound came from her chest. It was the laugh from the kitchen, but stronger this time. A genuine, shoulder-shaking laugh of pure, absurd relief. Back at Juniper Bluff, in the cold hour before dawn, Isadora cleaned their cuts without a word. By the light of a single candle, they opened the half-ledger. It was all there. Rowan's meticulous proof of Bram's thievery, and then, tucked into the back cover, Elowen found the page. A separate accounting. August 4th, 1883. Item Cinder Knoll smoothing. Recipient B, kettle. Disbursement 20 ounces gold. Note for clearing the way on the Price Ember Ferry matter. Elowen's fingers traced the words. "Clearing the way. He didn't just arrest you," Thad said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He was paid to frame you. This proves it. It's half the noose." "The other half," Elowen said, her eyes on the window, where the sky was just beginning to turn gray, "is on that train." They were back at Juniper Bluff just as the sky turned from black to a bruised, watery purple. The rain had begun. It was not a violent storm like the one in Cinder Knoll, but a rare, steady, soaking rain that promised life. It was cold, and it plastered their torn, muddy clothes to their skin. Isadora was waiting by the door, a lantern in her hand. She did not ask where they had been or what they had found. She simply saw the half-ledger in Thad's hand, the fresh mud and exhaustion on their faces, and she opened the door wide. She had hot water on the stove. She laid out towels, clean clothes for Thad, and one of her own older, softer shirts and a pair of Rowan's sturdy trousers for Elowen. She cleaned their cuts, a long scrape on Thad's arm, the raw, ropey burn on Elowen's wrists with a practiced, gentle hand. saying nothing. The silence was a comfort. The rain fell. It drummed on the patched tin roof, a constant, lulling rhythm that slowly unwound the coiled steel tension in Elowen's shoulders. The adrenaline from the depot, from the escape, was draining away, leaving a bone-deep weariness that was almost painful. She sat on a low stool by the kitchen stove, wrapped in one of Isadora's blankets, her wet hair unbound and dripping onto the floor. The kitchen was warm, filled with the sharp, clean smell of the rain and the rich, earthy scent of cornmeal. Isadora was busy at the counter, stirring a fresh batch of cornbread. Thad stood by the window, staring out at the rain, his shoulders slumped. He held the half-ledger in his hand like a dead weight. "He split it," he said, his voice rough. "Bram split the proof. He was always smarter than us." "We have half," Elowen said, her voice quiet. "We have the proof of Kettle. It's a start." "It's not enough," Thad said, turning from the window. "Not enough to stop the train. Not enough to clear Rowan." A low, distressed baa sound came from the barn, weak and thin, barely audible over the rain. Isadora wiped her hands on her apron. "The new calf," she said, her black eyes finding Thad's. "It is early, and the mother is weak." Thad nodded, his duty as a rancher pulling him from his grief. "I'll go." "No," Isadora said, placing a firm hand on his arm. "You are half dead, and you smell like a swamp. You will eat, and you will think. I will see to the calf. I know this mother. She does not trust men." She pulled a heavy wool shawl over her head, grabbed the lantern, and stepped out into the rain, pulling the door shut with a soft click. The sound of the latch seemed to echo in the sudden, profound quiet of the kitchen. It was just the two of them. The stove hissed. The rain drummed on the roof. Elowen felt the silence press in on her. It was too intimate. She was used to the noise of the forge, the shouts of the jail, the roar of the storm, the alarms. This quiet was unnerving. She was still wearing the long leather strap looped over her shoulder, her mother's hammer resting on her lap. The leather was soaked from the river marsh, cold and stiff. It would crack if it dried this way. She had to tend to it. She unbuckled the strap. It was heavy, and it pulled awkwardly at her mended, damp shirt. As she worked the buckle, the shirt shifted, the neckline dipping, revealing the pale, smooth skin of her shoulder, and the scar. It was not a new wound. It was old, white, and puckered, a long, ropey line that snaked from her collarbone down toward her shoulder blade. Thad, who had turned from the window, saw it, his gaze, which had been distant and preoccupied, sharpened. He did not move, but his eyes fixed on the mark. He looked from the scar to her face. He did not ask. He did not pity. He just waited. His silence was an invitation, more powerful than any question. Elowen found herself speaking, her voice low, the words tasting strange. "It's from Ember Ferry," she said, her fingers tracing the old, dead skin. "Not from a forge, a man, a customer. He claimed I'd overcharged him for shoeing his horse. He said I was built like a man, but he'd see if I was a woman underneath." She stopped, the memory thick in her throat. Thad remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on her face. "He grabbed me," she continued, her voice flatter, harder. "I broke his nose with my fist. He left, but he came back." "He came back that night, when my mother was sleeping. He didn't come in. He waited outside. He had a bullwhip. He just wanted to leave his mark, to prove he could." She had told no one, not her mother, who was too sick, not the law, who would have blamed her. It was her secret, her shame, the proof of her vulnerability. "I promised myself that night," she whispered, her hand closing over the scar, "that I would never be weak enough to let a man own me, that I would never be cornered. That's why, in the jail, I would have rather died." She looked up at him, expecting to see the usual expressions: disgust, pity, or worse, a flicker of that same hunger. Thad Vale's face was a mask of cold, quiet fury, but the anger was not for her. He moved then, crossing the small space between them. He stopped in front of her stool. He stood over her, his presence filling her vision. He was tall, his shirt damp from the rain, and he smelled of the clean, cold night air. He did not touch her. He just looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers. The admiration she had seen at the forge was back, but it was deeper now, mixed with a profound, terrible understanding. He was a fool, Thad said, his voice a low rumble, and a liar. Elowen's breath caught. She had been called unnatural, an ox, a monster. She had been called strong. She had never been defended. The space between them was electric, charged with the confession, with the rain, with the shared danger. She had spent her life building walls, as strong as any forge, and he had just seen the one place she was broken. She made a choice. Elowen rose from the stool. Slowly. She was tall, almost his height. She stood directly before him, so close that the warmth from the stove was blocked by his body. She did not retreat. She took one small half-step forward, closing the final, terrifying distance. Her breath, warm and shaky, hitched and misted on the cool, damp wool of his shirt. She looked up into his face. He was not moving. He was waiting, giving her the choice. He slowly raised his hand. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He placed his open palm on her shoulder, on the mended fabric of her shirt, his fingers spreading wide. It was not a gesture of possession. It was an anchor, a statement. I am here. The touch was light, but it felt as heavy as her hammer. She felt the calluses on his palm, the heat of his skin, even through the layers of cloth. She leaned into his hand, a fraction of an inch. It was all the answer he needed. His other hand came up, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. His fingers, rough from reins and rope, brushed the hair back from her temple. They were gentle, impossibly gentle. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. She did not flinch. Her eyes, locked on his, were wide. He lowered his head. He did not take. He did not demand. He met her. His lips touched hers. It was not a kiss of fire. It was a kiss of water, of rain, of cleansing. It was slow, and it was hesitant. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever done. Her eyelids, which had been stretched wide, suddenly felt heavy. They fluttered, and they closed. The world vanished, reduced to this single point of contact. Her hand, which had been clutching her mother's leather strap, opened. The strap fell to the floor, landing with a soft, muffled sound. She reached for him, her calloused, scarred smith's hand finding his. She did not cling to it. She interlaced her fingers with his. He gripped her hand, his strength matching hers, a perfect, equal pressure. Her other hand rose, resting on his chest. She could feel his heart, a heavy, rapid beat beneath her palm, a rhythm that matched the rain on the roof. The kiss deepened, but it remained gentle, a slow, profound exploration. It was a question and an answer. She felt his breath, warm against her skin, felt the tension in his arm, the solid, unyielding strength of him. Her own chest felt too tight, her lungs straining, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, soaring, unfamiliar lightness. He tasted of weak coffee and the clean, metallic tang of the rain. It was the taste of survival. When he finally, slowly, drew back, they did not move apart. They rested their foreheads together. Elowen kept her eyes closed, her world still tilting. She was trembling. He felt the tremor in her shoulders. Under his hand, he smiled, a small, soft smile that she felt more than saw. "You're not too much," he whispered, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "You're not too big or too strong. You are exactly enough. Elowen Price, you are enough to save this whole damn territory." She had spent her entire life hearing she was too much. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. A tear, hot and sudden, escaped her closed eye, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She pulled her head back, opening her eyes, Don't promise me things, she whispered, her voice rough.
Don't promise me anything but the truth.
The truth, he said, his gray eyes serious, is that I've been alone in this fight for a long time. The truth is, I want to be next to you when the fire is banked for the night, and I want to be next to you when it's roaring. The forge, her language. He understood. A small, hesitant smile touched her own lips. The warmth from his hand, from his mouth, was spreading through her. A slow, deep heat, like the heart of a well-banked forge, glowing steady and strong through the night. The kitchen door clicked open. They sprang apart. Not in guilt, but from instinct. Two fugitives breaking cover. Senora Isidora stood in the doorway, her shawl dripping, her face unreadable in the lantern light. She looked at the two of them. Standing a few feet apart by the fire, she saw the fallen leather strap on the floor. She saw the new light in her nephew's eyes, and the tremor in Elowen's hands. Isidora did not say a word. She looked at them, and then she turned, shut the door against the rain, and went to the stove to check her cornbread. The promise of the storm was now inside, and she was, for now, content to let it be. The lamp on the table guttered, its oil running low. Outside, the rain tapped on the eaves, a soft, steady rhythm, like a heart. Finally, at peace. They were partners, they were allies, and they were ready for the fire. The quiet of the rain-soaked dawn lasted less than an hour. The new, fragile peace of the kitchen was shattered not by thunder, but by a sound that was far more menacing, the drumming of shod hooves. Not one rider, but a dozen, moving fast, fanning out to surround the ranch. Elowen, who had been standing by the stove, her hand still tingling from Thad's touch, grabbed her hammer. Her body went cold, all the new warmth extinguished. Thad was at the window, his face grim. "It's Kettle." Isidora crossed herself. Once, her face hardening into a mask of stone. "Thaddeus Vale," Kettle's voice boomed from the yard, cutting through the hiss of the rain. "By the authority of the New Mexico Territory, I am here to serve a warrant for the arrest of the fugitive Elowen Price and to reclaim stolen property from the Black Silt Depot." Thad looked at Elowen. He knows we have the ledger. Get in the cellar," Thad ordered, pushing Elowen toward the trap door. "No," Elowen said, planting her feet. "I am done hiding in holes." Thad hesitated, saw the iron in her eyes, and nodded. "Tia, stay back." Thad and Elowen stepped onto the porch. The yard was filled with men. They were not lawmen. They were rough, wearing mismatched pieces of old uniforms, a black bandana tied around each man's hat. They were Bram's private enforcers, the Black Flag Cavalry, given the color of law by Kettle's badge. Kettle sat on his horse, a picture of smug authority, his hand resting on his pistol. Well, this is cozy. The rancher and the murderer. Give her up, Vale, and give me the book you stole." "She's not a murderer," Thad said, his voice level. "And that book is evidence." "Is that so?" Kettle laughed. "All I see is a fugitive resisting arrest and an accomplice. That gives me cause. Vale, search the property. Boys, turn it inside out. And if they resist, teach them some manners." The men dismounted, holstering their pistols and pulling heavy shotguns from their scabbards. They were not here to arrest. They were here to destroy. The first man kicked the kitchen door in, sending Isidora staggering back. Another ran to the corral. "The barn, boss!" one yelled. "It's harboring a fugitive's horse, ain't it?" Kettle sneered. "Cleanse it. Burn it." The man holding a torch, still lit from their ride, laughed and tossed it into the open doorway of the hay barn. The effect was instantaneous. The dry hay on the inside exploded in a whoosh of orange flame. The rain, which had soaked the outer roof, was useless against the inferno within. A high, piercing, terrified scream came from inside the barn. "Night lantern!" "No!" Thad yelled, and sprinted toward the burning building. He got to the main door, but a wall of flame and black, choking smoke beat him back. I can't get in! Los terneros!" Isidora screamed. "Not at the fire, but at the cattle pen." Ignoring the men, she grabbed a feed sack, flapping it and shouting. driving the small, coughing herd of calves out of the pen and down into the deep, muddy arroyo behind the house, just as two of Kettle's men headed for them. She was not fighting the fire, she was saving the future, the only thing of value the ranch had left. Elowen saw Thad beating uselessly at the flames, his face a mask of terror. She saw the horse's shadow, rearing in panic behind the wall of fire. She didn't think. She ran. She didn't run to the barn. She ran to the forge shed. Her hand closed around a long, heavy iron hook, one used for branding. "Thad the tin," she roared, her voice carrying over the fire. She ran to the side of the barn, away from the main door. The tin patching Isadora and Thad had used was nailed to the wooden frame. Elowen jammed the hook under the edge of a sheet, planted her feet, and pulled. She used her entire body, her shoulders, her back, the leverage of her height. The wood splintered, the nails shrieked, and a 3-foot-wide section of the tin wall ripped away, creating a new, ragged opening. Smoke poured out, but it was low to the ground. "Get her go," Elowen yelled, already moving to the next section of tin, the metal edges slicing at her hands. Thad didn't hesitate. He dropped to his belly and crawled through the hole Elowen had made. He vanished into the suffocating blackness. Elowen was a machine. Hook, plant, pull, rip. She tore another section away, creating a massive, gaping hole in the side of the barn. "They're trying to save the horse," one of Kettle's men shouted, laughing. "Put him down!" The men raised their shotguns, not with bullets. Kettle wanted them alive and broken. "Salt 'em," Kettle ordered. A whomp of a dozen shotguns, a spray of rock salt, like a swarm of angry hornets, slammed into the side of the barn, stinging Elowen's back and neck. It was agonizing, but she didn't flinch. "Thad!" she screamed into the hole. A shadow moved in the smoke. Thad burst out, choking, his hair singed. He was pulling the bridle of the half-mad, smoke-blinded night lantern. The mare bolted, dragging him clear just as the main beam of the barn roof collapsed with a sound like a cannon shot, sending a geyser of sparks 40 feet into the air. "Get behind the house," Thad yelled, shoving Elowen. "No time," Elowen gasped. The men were reloading, advancing, fanning out. Elowen looked around, desperate. The searchers had torn the heavy oak door from the smokehouse and thrown it in the yard. It was 3 inches of solid wood. She grabbed it. With a grunt that tore from her throat, she heaved the massive door up, holding it in front of her body like a shield. "Get behind me," she ordered Thad. Thad, stunned, dove behind her just as the second volley hit. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy pellets of salt hammered the oak shield. A brutal, deafening drumbeat. Eyed the door. Elowen was an immovable object, her knuckles white, her feet planted in the mud. She was protecting him. "We're pinned," Thad said, peering around the edge. "They're circling." Suddenly, a high-velocity zing echoed from the ridge high above the ranch. It was not a shotgun. It was a rifle. One of the lanterns on Kettle's wagon exploded. "What in the—" one of the thugs yelled, spinning around. Zing! Another shot. This one didn't hit a man. It hit the metal hinge on the wagon's tailgate, shattering it. "Ambush," Kettle roared, his face turning from smug to furious. "It's the Ute. It's that bastard Rook get to cover." The organized attack dissolved into chaos. Rook B'nai Pa, hidden in the rocks 1,000 yards away, was conducting an orchestra of chaos. He shot out the lamps. He shot the reins from a man's hand. He wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to terrify, to disarm. The night of the depot raid. They had planned this. Rook was their only defense. In the confusion, as the Black Flag cavalry scrambled for cover, their backs to the house, Kettle saw his opening. He wasn't panicking. He had one goal. He leaped onto the porch, kicked open the splintered kitchen door, and ran inside. "The ledger!" Thad yelled. They dropped the shield door and ran after him. They skidded to a stop in the kitchen doorway. The room was a wreck. But Kettle was there, by the fireplace. He had Thad's carved box in one hand and the half-ledger in the other. Always keep your evidence in a fireproof box. Veil. Kettle sneered, tapping the metal safe box he'd ripped from the wall. But you kept this in a wooden one. Stupid. Thad lunged. Elowen raised her hammer. I wouldn't, Kettle said, leveling his revolver. The barrel was black and steady. This was not a salt gun. I've got what I came for. Bram will be pleased. He backed out of the door, his eyes on both of them. Don't bother trying to be heroes. He gestured to the smoking, collapsing ruin of the barn, the rain hissing on the embers. You've got nothing left to be a hero with. He smiled, his yellow teeth flashing in the gloom. The RX-13 leaves Cinder Knoll Monday morning, bright and early, with me, Mr. Bram, and this little book. You want to stop it, you just try. He holstered his pistol, swung onto his horse, and with a final, contemptuous look, he galloped away, his men following, a panicked, disorganized rabble fleeing Rook's ghost-like rifle fire. Silence fell. There was only the sound of the rain and the hiss of the dying fire. The barn was gone. The house was scorched. The corral was a ruin. Thad walked into the middle of the yard, the rain plastering his singed hair to his head. He looked at the smoking black skeleton of his family's dream. He sank to his knees in the mud. He had lost Rowan. Now he had lost the ranch, and he had lost the only proof that could avenge any of it. He was empty. Elowen walked to him. She stood over him, her shadow falling on his bowed back. She was covered in soot, her hands raw and bleeding from pulling the hot tin. This she knew, the smell of ash, the taste of total loss. This was Ember Ferry. She placed her hand on his shoulder. It was steady. He's gone, Thad whispered, his voice broken. It's over. He won. Elowen's grip tightened. He took paper, she said, her voice a low, resonant growl. He took wood and hay. He burnt a building. She knelt beside him in the mud, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes, in her soot-blackened face, were burning with a light that had nothing to do with the fire. This house is burnt, Thaddeus. The barn is gone, but the forge is still burning inside us. He didn't put that out. He stared at her, at this impossible woman who had been to the bottom and was now pulling him back. He took her bleeding hand, lacing his fingers with hers. Their shared vow of vengeance, which had been forged in a jail cell, was now retempered in the ashes of their home. Mijo. Isadora was there. She had returned from the arroyo. The calves safe. She had seen it all. She saw the ledger was gone, and she saw the new, harder bond between them. She went into the house, into her small, untouched room. She returned a moment later. She held a small, tarnished silver chain. On it was a pendant, a flat disc etched with a compass rose, a wind star. She didn't give it to Thad. She pressed it, hard, into Elowen's hand. This was my mother's, from the old country, Isadora said, her black eyes meeting Elowen's. Para que el viento te guíe a la verdad, to let the wind guide you to the truth. You are not fire, Nina. You are the wind that directs it. Thad stood, pulling Elowen up with him. He's right about one thing, Thad said, his voice raw. We have nothing. We can't stop a train. We can't, a new voice said. Rook B'nai Pa stepped from the mist, his rifle resting on his shoulder. A ranch cannot, but a town can. That night, in the back room of the Red Dog Saloon in Cinder Knoll, a different kind of alliance was formed. Mateo Doss, the owner, whose liquor license Bram had threatened. Nora Flint, the schoolteacher, whose small school fund Bram had seized for unpaid taxes. They were there, their faces pale and angry. He has the last piece of evidence, Thad told them, his voice flat. He leaves on the RX-13 on Monday. He will be gone, and Bram will own this territory. Mateo stopped wiping the glass he was holding. He looked at Nora. Bram and Kettle think we are all sheep, Mateo said, his voice a low growl. They think they can burn us out, one by one. Nora Flint, her small hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, looked at Elowen. She saw the burns, the soot, the hammer at her belt. "He's bled us all," Nora said, her voice trembling but gaining a core of steel. "He's taken enough. Show us how to stop the snake." Monday morning, the hour before sunrise. The air in Shale Teeth Canyon was so cold it felt solid, a block of ice pressing against the skin. The plan was desperate, forged in the back room of a saloon, and it relied entirely on a ghost. The dead-end spur line was Rowan Vale's creation, a maintenance track he had surveyed, built into a narrow cut in the canyon wall. It ran for 300 feet and ended abruptly at the edge of a sheer 200-foot drop into the arroyo. Elowen was not idle. She moved in the gloom, her mother's hammer at her belt, her custom-forged wrench looped on its leather strap. She was placing the shims. They were heavy, greased blocks of seasoned oak, which she wedged precisely between the switch points and the main rail. They were not meant to stop the train. They were meant to guide it, to absorb the terrible, jarring shock of the switch and prevent the armored car from bucking, derailing, and killing everyone on board. It was a Smith solution, not brute force, but calculated, controlled diversion, 50 yards down the spur line. Thad and Mateo Doss were checking the snares. They had spent the night sinking deadman anchors into the rocky soil, rigging 2 heavy steel winch cables, stolen from the depot, across the tracks. They were designed to catch the car's axles, a heavy-duty trap. On the ridge high above, Rook Benet Pa and Nora Flint were in position. They were not armed with rifles. They were armed with 3 large, metal barrels, filled with a damp mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and coal dust, a concoction Elowen had specified. The weight was absolute. The only sound was the wind, a low moan in the teeth of the canyon. Then, Elowen felt it, a faint vibration in the soles of her boots. It was not a sound. It was a tremor in the steel. "It's coming," she said. Thad and Mateo tensed at the switch lever, a heavy 4-foot iron bar they had jammed into the mechanism. A single, piercing headlight cut the darkness, illuminating the narrow canyon. It was not a heavy freight engine. It was the RX-13, a sleek, black, custom-built Pullman car, its windows barred, its steel sides reinforced. It was a private fortress on wheels, pushed by a small, powerful engine. Inside, Bram and Kettle were oblivious, protected, moving fast toward their escape. Rook's signal came from the ridge, a single, sharp clack of 2 stones struck together. "Now," Thad grunted. He and Mateo threw their entire weight onto the lever. The switch was old, rusted from disuse. It groaned, a high, metallic shriek of protest. For a terrible second, it held. "Together!" Elowen yelled. Running to them, she added her weight. The 3 of them, a combined force of desperation, hung from the bar, with a sound like a pistol shot. The rust broke, and the heavy points of the rail slid over. The RX-13 hit the switch. The engineer in the pusher engine saw the track move, his hand flying to the whistle. A shriek of pure panic. The armored car's wheels struck Elowen's oaken shims. There was no crash. Only a heavy, groaning crunch as the oak compressed, smoking, absorbing the multi-ton impact. The car, instead of derailing, slid smoothly, perfectly, onto the dead-end spur. "It's on!" Thad yelled. Letting go of the lever, the car was moving fast, charging down the short track. It hit Thad's steel cables. The twang of the cables snapping taut was loud enough to be heard in Cinder Knoll. They held. The car was snagged, its axles gripped by the steel loops, and it shuddered to a violent, groaning, metallic halt. Inside, muffled shouts and the sound of breaking glass. "Now! Nora! Now!" Rook yelled from the ridge. Nora, her face pale but resolved, threw her lit match into the barrel. The effect was immediate. The 3 smoke pots ignited. Not with an explosion, but with a deep volcanic whoosh. A tidal wave of thick, choking, impenetrable black smoke poured down the canyon walls, enveloping the trapped train in absolute darkness. Kettle's hired guards, riding in a separate car behind the engine, piled out, completely blind, firing their pistols wildly into the black, sulphurous clouds. "Ambush, we're under attack," The diversion had begun. Elowen did not wait. While the guards were firing at shadows, she was running, low and fast, straight toward the armored car. She used the coupling between the engine and the Pullman as a ladder, her boots finding purchase. She grabbed the roof rail and hauled herself up. The roof was curved, slick with the cold morning dew. Bullets from the panicked guards zinged past her in the smoke, ricocheting off the steel. She ignored them. The safe. It was just as Rowan's schematic had shown. Not inside, but bolted directly to the roof frame. A heavy, fireproof strongbox. She pulled the custom wrench from her belt. She jammed the socket onto the first hexagonal bolt head. It was tight, sealed with paint. She threw her entire weight onto the tool. Her arms, her back, her shoulders, every ounce of her forge-given strength. The bolt shrieked, but it turned. A drop of sweat, cold and sharp, ran from her hairline and into her eye, stinging, blinding her. She didn't wipe it. She blinked, her world a blur of tears and smoke, and moved to the second bolt. Below her, the guards were coughing, confused, their shots becoming more sporadic. Screech! The second bolt gave. Screech! The third! There's someone on the roof, a voice yelled from below. A guard, smarter than the rest, had seen her silhouette against the graying sky. Elowen didn't have time for the fourth bolt. She put the head of her mother's hammer against it and struck. Once. A perfect, calculated blow. The high-carbon steel bolt head shattered. She ripped the heavy iron lid of the safe open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the other half of the ledger. She grabbed it. Her fingers frantically searched the bottom of the safe. Yes, a single sheet of paper, folded. A hand grabbed the ladder beside her. Sheriff Kettle, his face purple with rage, hauled himself onto the roof, his revolver in his hand. "It's over, Smith," he roared, lunging for her, grabbing not for her, but for the book. "Give me that." Elowen stuffed the ledger and the letter inside her shirt. She met his charge. He was bigger than her, heavier. He aimed his pistol at her chest. She did not swing at his head. She did not swing at his arm. She was a smith, not a brawler. She swung her hammer. A short, precise, upward arc. The flat face of the hammer connected, not with his flesh, but with the steel barrel of his revolver. Clang. The sound was as pure as her anvil. The impact was perfect. The gun, struck from below, was torn from Kettle's grip. It flew into the air, spinning, and vanished into the smoke. Kettle stared at his empty, stinging hand in disbelief. He was overbalanced, his lunge carrying him forward. He stumbled past her, his arms pinwheeling. He fell from the edge of the roof. He vanished. Elowen heard a heavy, winded woof. She peered over the edge. Mateo and Thad, in their planning, had anticipated this. They had shoveled a massive, 6-foot-deep pile of soft sand and river gravel directly beside the track. Kettle was alive, half buried, his wind knocked out, but completely, infuriatingly, safe. The plan remained bloodless. A terrible, groaning crack echoed from under the car. "Elowen!" Thad yelled from the ground. "The anchor, it's breaking!" The steel cable, under the strain of the multi-ton car, was tearing its anchor from the earth. The entire train lurched forward, sliding 2 feet. The engineer in the cab screamed. The car was sliding toward the end of the line, toward the abyss. Thad didn't look at Elowen. He didn't look at Kettle. He sprinted. He ran past the guards, past the smoke, and leaped onto the front platform of the armored car. Just as the last cable anchor tore free, the car was rolling. Thad grabbed the large, iron handbrake wheel. He spun it, his boots skidding on the steel platform, his muscles straining against the momentum. The brake shoes bit, showering the tracks with a fountain of orange sparks. The engineer, his face white, was frozen in terror. The car shrieked, groaned, and shuddered. It stopped. Its front wheels hung suspended in the air, 2 inches over the sheer, 200-foot drop. Thad, his arms aching, let go of the wheel. He looked at the shaken engineer and nodded. "You're safe. Now!" He roared back. Elowen stuffed her wrench and hammer into her belt, the precious ledger safe against her skin. She didn't climb down. She jumped, landing hard in the rocky soil, rolling to absorb the impact. Rook and Nora were already there, leading Night Lantern and Thad's Bay from a hidden ravine. "Kettle's down. Bram's still locked in the car," Thad yelled, jumping from the brake platform and grabbing his reins. They mounted. The whole operation had taken less than 5 minutes. As the smoke began to clear, Kettle's men were just realizing what had happened. They were left with their winded boss, an undamaged but hopelessly trapped train car, and an engineer who was slowly fainting from terror. The Allies didn't ride for Cinder Knoll. They turned their horses east, toward the rising sun, toward the county seat. They rode for Ash Mesa. They arrived just as the courthouse doors were opening. They didn't stop to clean off the soot, the sulfur, or the mud. They walked, a collection of fugitives, ranchers, and schoolteachers, past the stunned clerk and straight into the chambers of the circuit judge. Judge Harlan, a man with a face like dried parchment, looked up from his desk, his glasses perched on his nose. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? Get out of my chambers." Elowen walked forward. She unbuttoned her shirt. She pulled out the 2 halves of the milepost ledger and the single, folded, ink-stained letter. She slapped them onto the polished mahogany desk. The whump of the books echoed in the silent, wood-paneled room. "Meaning," Elowen's voice was a raw, exhausted croak. "That is the meaning, Your Honor." Thad stepped beside her. "That," he said, tapping the first half, "is the list of bribes paid to Sheriff Bram Kettle. And that," he tapped the second half, "is the list of every rancher and merchant Lucius Bram has extorted for the last 2 years." Elowen pushed the single letter forward. "And that is Bram's signed order, directing the man who framed me to burn the warehouse in Ember Ferry and see that I was blamed for the murder." Judge Harlan, his mouth open, unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned it. He looked at the ledgers. His face went from pale to a dark, angry red. "We aren't just bringing you evidence, Judge," Thad said, his voice ringing with a new, cold authority. "We are demanding a trial, a public trial, before Lucius Bram can buy his way out of this." "A trial," the judge stammered, looking at the damning, indisputable proof. "When," Elowen leaned forward, her raw, Smith's hands flat on his desk. "Today," she said. "We demand a public hearing, by noon." By high noon, the Ash Mesa County Courthouse was not a hall of justice. It was a tinderbox. Judge Harlan had dispatched federal marshals to Shale Teeth Canyon, and the RX-13, a fortress of steel, had been tamely surrendered. Lucius Bram and Sheriff Kettle were brought to Ash Mesa in irons, not by the law they controlled, in the town they owned, but by a higher, federal power. Word had spread faster than a prairie fire. Rook Benet Pa had ridden to the northern ranches. Mateo Doss had closed his saloon, posting a simple sign, "Gone to see a hanging or prevent one." Nora Flint had told the families of Cinder Knoll that the trial for their stolen school money was happening right now. They came. They filled the polished oak benches, stood 4 deep against the back wall, and spilled out into the hallway. The room was stifling, thick with the smell of wet wool, nervous sweat, and a low, simmering, collective rage. Sheriff Bram Kettle was a ruin. He was brought in first, his face the color of wet ash, his hands shaking so violently the chains rattled a constant, desperate rhythm. He looked at the crowd, at the hard, unpitying faces, and seemed to shrink inside his clothes. Then came Lucius Bram. He was immaculate. The marshals had allowed him to wash, to change. He wore a fine wool suit, and beside him, striding with an unearned confidence, was a lawyer from Santa Fe, a man in a tailored frock coat, with a high collar, hair slicked with macassar oil, and teeth so white they looked false. He smiled at the judge, a cold, polished smile that did not reach his eyes. Judge Harlan, the lawyer, a Mr. Finch, began, his voice smooth and condescending. "This is a farce, a circus. We move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Mr. Bram. and against the duly appointed sheriff, Mr. Kettle. Judge Harlan, small behind his massive desk, looked down at the two halves of the ledger. They sat before him, an accusation in leather. "A motion to dismiss," the judge said, his voice weak. "On what grounds, Counselor?" "On all grounds, Your Honor," Finch said, laughing lightly, as if explaining to a child. "These items," he gestured to the ledgers, "were obtained by the known escaped fugitive Elowin Price. They were stolen. That makes them inadmissible. Furthermore, this entire proceeding is based on the word of an armed, violent criminal who, I might add, attacked a territorial train this very morning." He turned, his smile becoming a sneer, and pointed directly at Elowin, who stood with Thad, Isadora, and the others, still covered in soot and mud.
"This is vigilantism, not justice. Release my clients."
The crowd murmured, a low, angry sound. The ranchers gripped their hats. Judge Harlan swallowed, looking from the lawyer to the ledgers. He was a man of procedure. He was wavering. Elowin Price stepped forward. She walked past the bar, into the open space before the desk. She did not ask permission. She simply occupied the space, her mother's hammer at her belt, her presence a solid, undeniable fact. "Your Honor?" Her voice was not loud. It was not a plea. It was a statement. It was clear and resonant. A single, perfectly struck note from an anvil, and it cut through the hot, stifling air. The entire room went silent. "My name is Elowin Price," she said, her eyes locked on the judge's. "I am the fugitive Mr. Finch speaks of—" "This woman has no right to address the court," Finch snapped. "I am speaking in my own defense," Elowin said, never breaking her gaze from Harlan. Her voice was flat, a hammer striking hot iron. "You have on your desk a signed order, in Lucius Bram's hand, directing Sheriff Kettle to frame me for a murder I did not commit. You have a ledger detailing the bribe he paid. I am not the criminal in this room. Your Honor, I am the first witness." The judge looked down at the letter. He looked at Bram, whose cold smile was gone. "Proceed, Miss Price," the judge said, his voice gaining a fraction of steel. "But I warn you, be brief." "I will be," Elowin said. "I call Rook Benepa." Rook moved from the shadows of the doorway. He stood before the judge, not in the witness box, but in the center of the room, as Elowin had. "I was Rowan Vale's guide," Rook said, his voice soft, yet it carried to every corner. "He was my friend. He was not a clumsy man. He did not slip under that cart. I saw the tracks. I saw the maintenance cart. The brake line was filed. It was cut, made to look like it frayed. It was cut with a tool from the railroad yard." "Conjecture," Finch shouted. "The ramblings of an uneducated savage." Rook's dark eyes turned on the lawyer. "I can read a cut brake line, lawyer, and I read the tracks. There were 2 sets of boot prints, not one. One was Rowan's, the other was heavy. From a man who stood and watched. The same boot prints I later saw at the depot, worn by Mr. Bram's personal guards." A gasp went through the room. "I call Senora Isadora Quintero," Elowin's voice continued. "The rhythm building, clang." Isadora walked forward, her back rigid. She looked at Kettle, who refused to meet her gaze. She did not speak. She simply unwrapped the clean white bandage from her left hand and forearm. She held her hand up for the judge, for the entire room, to see. The burn was angry, red and weeping. The skin bubbled and raw. "This," Isadora said, her voice shaking with a cold, pure rage, "is the law in Cinder Knoll. This is Sheriff Kettle's search warrant. This is the mark of Lucius Bram's progress. They burned my barn. They tried to burn my home. This is what I received when I tried to save my animals from the fire they set." The growl in the crowd was louder now. This was not a document. This was flesh. "I call Mateo Doss," Elowin said. Clang, Mateo, the saloon keeper, stepped up. He, too, held a book, his own ledger. "This is a list. Judge, Joseph Allen, lost his ranch. Maria Flores, lost her farm. The Hartzell brothers, lost their grazing land. Every one of them. foreclosed on by Mr. Bram's bank, after Sheriff Kettle served them with new, impossible tax levies. Or after Mr. Bram's railroad suddenly tripled their freight rates. This isn't a ledger. Judge, it's a land grab. And I call Nora Flint.
Clang!
The small schoolteacher walked to the front. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She held a stack of children's letters. This is not my testimony. Your Honor, this is from the children of Cinder Knoll. This one, she held up a piece of paper, is from Sarah Allen, Joseph's daughter. She asks why I have no books. This one is from young Tom Flores, who asks why we have no stove. Nora's voice broke, but she mastered it. We have no books, and we have no stove, because the school fund, the money this very county approved, was seized by Sheriff Kettle for unpaid territorial fees. Fees that Mr. Bram's railroad, conveniently, was exempt from. Our children are cold and illiterate, Your Honor, so Mr. Bram could have his victory. Finch was on his feet, his face slick with sweat. This is slander. It's a circus, a list of disgruntled pioneers and a burned hand. You have shown no connection, no proof of conspiracy. The connection, Elowen said, her voice dropping, is in the ink. She stepped back to the judge's desk. She opened the black ledger. Rowan Vale kept his records in a specific, homemade ink, iron gallet, rust ink. I know it. I smelled it. It's made with iron filings from a forge or a rail yard. It has a unique, gritty texture. She then reached into the burlap sack she had carried from the ranch, a sack that held the evidence from the fire. She pulled out a single, heavy, canvas work glove. It was caked in dried mud and scorched black at the cuff. When Sheriff Kettle burned our ranch, he was careless, Elowen said, her voice a flat, cold line. He dropped this in the mud while he was stealing the other half of the ledger from the kitchen. She held it up. This is his glove, and this. She pointed to a dark, reddish-brown smear on the inside of the wrist. Is the same iron gallet ink, still wet from the ledger he had just touched, the ledger he was delivering to Mr. Bram. The chain was forged. The ink on the book, the ink on the glove, the hand of the law, stained with the proof of the crime. It was over. Bram Kettle let out a sound, a high, choked, wheezing gasp. Lucius Bram saw it. He saw the glove. He saw the judge's face. He saw the ranchers in the aisle. He saw the main door, blocked by the families he had destroyed. His composure, the mask of cold civilization, shattered. He turned, not to his lawyer, but to the judge's private door, the escape route. He's running, Nora Flint screamed. The crowd surged. A single, solid wall of bodies. Mateo Doss and two ranchers blocked the door. Bram was trapped. Kettle saw the trap spring shut. He saw the faces, hard as stone, surrounding him. He saw Elowen standing there, her hammer at her belt, her judgment delivered. He babbled, his hand flying to his chest. He made me, he said, just clear the way. It was just business. My heart, I can't breathe. He crumpled to the floor, gasping, his body betraying him, a pathetic, weeping heap of fear. Thad Vale stepped into the sudden, stunned silence. He walked past the collapsing Kettle, past the trapped Bram. He stood next to Elowen. He looked at Bram. My brother's death was not an accident, Thad said, his voice low, shaking with a year of suppressed grief. He pointed to the ledger. You stole his work. You used his maps. And then you had him murdered. He held up the final, damning letter, the one from the train safe. And you called it clearing the way. You cleared my brother. You cleared Elowen. You cleared all these people out of your path. It's over. Bram. Judge Harlan stood up. His face, which had been pale and weak, was now a dark, thunderous red. He looked at the ledgers, at the glove, at the weeping Kettle, at the trapped, hyperventilating Bram. He raised his gavel high. Bang, the sound was like a gunshot. This hearing is concluded. The judge's voice boomed. His authority finally, fully, returned. Deputy marshals, Take Sheriff Bram Kettle into custody. He is charged with conspiracy, arson, and accessory to murder. Bang. Deputy Marshals, take Mr. Lucius Bram into custody. He is charged with conspiracy, extortion, theft, and the murder of Rowan Vale. His assets, and the assets of the Black Silt Depot, are hereby frozen, pending a full criminal trial. The marshals moved, pulling Bram, who was now silent and shaking, away from the door. The judge's eyes fell on Elwyn. His face softened. And by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I declare the warrant for Elwyn Price to be null and void. The charges are dismissed, all charges. With the profound apology of this territory, your name is cleared. Miss Price, you are a free woman. The room was silent for one. Stunned heartbeat. Then, Nora Flint let out a sob. Mateo Doss let out a wild whoop, and the entire courthouse erupted. It was a roar, a wave of pure, cathartic release. It was the sound of a 2-year drought breaking, the sound of thunder, the sound of rain. Amid the chaos, Thad looked at Elwyn. She was just standing. Her hand was resting on the head of her mother's hammer. She was breathing, slow and deep. Bram, in chains, was led past her. He looked at her, his eyes full of a disbelief that was more profound than his hate. She had not burned him. She had not shot him. She had not hung him. She had simply shown the truth. She had taken their lies, their whispers, their greed, their ink, and their handprints, and she had held them up to the light. She had not met their violence with violence. She had met it with fact, and it had been enough. It did not happen overnight, but it happened. The trial of Lucius Bram sent a shockwave through the territory. His assets, frozen by the court, were broken up. The land he had stolen was returned, piece by piece, to the ranchers he had extorted. Their debts and false taxes declared void. The Black Silt Depot was put under federal receivership, and the RX-13 was rerouted. Its days of private tyranny over, Juniper Bluff was rebuilt. It was not rebuilt by Thad and Elwyn alone. The day after the verdict, Mateo Doss arrived in a wagon, not with whiskey, but with lumber and 3 hammers. Nora Flint came with him, bringing her older students, who set about clearing the scorched debris. The ranchers from the north, the ones whose land had been saved by the ledger, arrived with wagons of fresh hay, feed, and 3 new calves for Isadora. They rebuilt the barn first. It was a barn raising born of justice, not just neighborly duty. The sound of hammers echoed across the mesa, a new, busy song that replaced the silence of grief. And in the center of the new ranch yard, where it could catch the sun from dawn until dusk, Elwyn Price built her forge. It was not the small, failing forge of Juniper Bluff. It was not the memory of her mother's shop in Ember Ferry. It was new. She had retrieved her mother's heavy anvil from the burned-out shell of the old town, its face pitted but its heart still true. She set it on a solid oak stump, and when she struck her first piece of steel, the clear, ringing clang was a declaration. Juniper Bluff was alive. Thad found her there late one afternoon, a week after the barn was finished. The sun was setting, sending long, golden shafts of light through the gaps in the new pine boards. The barn was quiet, filled with the warm, sweet smell of fresh-cut hay. Elwyn was standing by a stall, her hand resting on the smooth, planed wood. She was not working. She was just still. The light caught the soot on her cheek and the fine, strong lines of her profile. Thad walked up beside her. He didn't speak for a long time. They just stood together, breathing in the scent of their new life. The scent of peace. He reached out, his calloused rancher's hand covering her calloused smith's hand where it rested on the wood. Her skin was warm from the forge fire she had just banked. "You built this," he said, his voice a low rumble. All of this, you brought it back." "We built it," she said, her voice soft. She did not pull her hand away. She turned it, her fingers lacing with his. He stepped closer, moving into her space. She leaned her head back against the stall post, looking up at him. The shadows in the barn were deepening. and the world seemed to shrink to the space they occupied. "Do you remember what I told you?" he whispered, his other hand coming up, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "That I wanted to be next to you? When the fire was roaring, and when it was banked." "I remember," she breathed. "The fire is banked, Eloan," he said. He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. It was not the first desperate kiss in the rain-soaked kitchen. This was a kiss of certainty. It was slow, and it was deep, a profound acknowledgement of everything they had survived. His lips were chapped, real, and they tasted of the clean dust of the mesa and of home. Her hand, the one laced with his, gripped him tightly. Her other arm, the one that could swing a hammer and tear down a wall, wrapped around his waist, pulling him closer. He held her. He held her with the strength of a man who had seen her power and was not afraid of it, but grateful for it. She pressed her face into the curve of his neck, her entire body, which had been coiled tight for years, finally, truly, letting go. She was not holding him up. She was not holding herself up. They were holding each other. They stood there for a long time, in the golden light of the new barn, breathing in time, their hearts beating a steady, quiet rhythm. It was a promise made without words, a passionate, silent oath. She pulled back, but only a little. She looked at him, her eyes clear, then led him from the barn to the forge. The fire was banked, as he said, but the coals still pulsed with a deep, orange heart. She pulled on her heavy leather gloves. He watched, confused. She did not take a piece of new steel. She reached for a specific object, lying by the anvil. It was a railroad spike, one of many they had pulled from the ties at Shale Teeth Canyon, a symbol of Bram's iron, of his oppression. She plunged it into the heart of the coals and worked the bellows. The spike began to glow. She pulled it out, a piece of raw, burning light. She laid it on the anvil. Clang, clang, clang. She worked with a fierce, beautiful precision. She was not just bending steel. She was destroying a symbol and forging a new one. She hammered the ugly, brutal iron, folding it, shaping it, driving the impurities out until the metal itself was transformed. She worked until the thick, heavy spike had become a simple, thick, polished band. She plunged it into the slack tub, and a furious, victorious hiss of steam filled the cooling air. She took off her gloves. She held the ring out to him. It was silver bright, polished, and still warm from the fire. Thad looked at the ring, the transformed metal. He looked at her strong, proud, soot-streaked face. He took the ring, and then, his eyes never leaving hers, he knelt. He knelt on the soft, dark earth of the ranch they had saved, the earth that had been watered and blessed. He took her left hand, the smith's hand, scarred and powerful. "This isn't about saving each other, Eloan," he said, his voice thick, his gray eyes shining. "We already did that. This is about living right, together, if you'll have me." Eloan did not cry. She just smiled, a slow, radiant smile that lit her face from within. She nodded. Once, he slid the ring she had made, onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. From the porch of the rebuilt house, Isidora Quintero watched. She smiled, a rare, full smile. She reached up and hung the small, silver wind star on a nail above the new doorway. "Para que el viento recuerde el camino a casa," she whispered, "so the wind remembers its way home." Rook B'nai Pa did not stay for the celebration. His work was done. He left Juniper Bluff as he had come, a silent shadow on a Mustang. But he left a message, pressed into the earth with stones, a promise. "When the forge fire runs low, call my name." The town of Cinder Knoll changed. The sign at the edge of town, the one that had been shot full of holes, was taken down. In its place, the townspeople erected a new one, carved from fresh pine. It read, "Cinder Knoll, where law is justice, and justice has receipts." That night, the entire territory, it seemed, came to Juniper Bluff. It was not a party. It was a festival. Mateo brought his best. Nora brought a guitar. The children of the ranchers, the ones who had their farms back, ran laughing through the yard, no longer afraid. They ate cornbread and roasted beef under the vast, starry sky. Elowen, her hands clean, the silver ring bright on her finger, stood by the fire. She was no longer the outcast, the unnatural woman built like an ox. She was Elowen, the smith, the ally. The children ran to her, asking her to show them the forge. And she was not mocked for her body. She was celebrated for her strength, for her virtue. Later, as the guitar played a soft, hopeful tune, she stood on the porch, her arm linked with Thad's. Isadora sat in her rocker, tapping her foot to the music. Elowen looked out at the horizon, the same horizon she had run toward. A fugitive. It was no longer a place to escape to, or a line she could not cross. It was just the edge of the land she had claimed, the land she had fought for. She was no longer the one being chosen, the one being framed, the one being hunted. She was the one who chose. She chose the steel. She chose the fight. And she chose the man who stood beside her. They'll tell you that love in the Old West was a fragile thing, a damsel's prize or a cowboy's conquest. They're wrong. It was not measured by the smallness of a woman's waist or the whispers of a town. It was measured in the real things. It was balanced by the sweat on the back of a shirt. It was found in calloused hands, hands that knew how to build, how to fight, and how to hold on. It was found in the truth, written in ink that would not fade. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please share your city or country in the comments below, along with your thoughts on Elowen's journey. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you can, support us by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.